Right, let's get on with today's show and meet our first guest, and let's get into green financing. BetaCarbon is gamifying carbon offsetting by providing beta tokens for every carbon offset you purchase. The tokens will allow consumers to add value to their carbon offsetting. And to tell us more is founder Guy Dickinson. Guy, welcome to the Startup Daily Show. You are going to have to walk us all through this, but I suppose the way I think about this is a little bit like frequent flyer points for people who are carbon offsetting.
Well, look, thanks for the opportunity today to introduce BetaCarbon, Simon. Now, offsetting and BetaCarbon are actually interrelated, but two very different things. So to make an offset, you need a carbon credit, and you would retire that carbon credit to create an offset, and that is effectively a donation. And your money would be effectively gone at that point. You may get a tax deduction for that, which is admirable, and we have no issue with that. But the Australian carbon credit market is highly inaccessible from a point of view that to actually buy a carbon credit as an individual or even a mid-sized tier company is extremely difficult. Even as a high net worth investor, it's extremely difficult. And the reason for that is to own the carbon credit, you need to open a registry account with the Clean Energy Regulator. And that process is long and arduous, and you also need a great deal of capital to do your first trade because it's generally the participation is wholesale. If we talk about the last few quarters in the carbon market, there was only 54 counterparties that actively traded this asset class, and that shows you the depth of the difficulty to access that asset class. And BetaCarbon took it upon itself to open up that market. We felt that it was really important that for such an important asset class that effectively is pricing pollution, we should have the opportunity as consumers and individuals to help sway that agenda, see what that looks like in the future. And BetaCarbon's primary mission is to incentivize more carbon farming. And it won't take a genius to understand that the best way to incentivize action is price. And we feel that when you look at the Australian carbon price on a global basis, if I give you an example now, it's $55 is the last trade in the Australian market, circa $75 in New Zealand, closer to 120 in Europe for the same ton of carbon. And we feel that if you pollute in Australia, then you should probably be incentivizing carbon projects in Australia at the same time.
All right, Guy, I'm just going to drill down a little bit more so we can really get our heads around this. And I'm going to stick with the analogy for the time being in terms of flight, because of course, when you buy a flight, they're often asked if you want to kick in a couple more dollars to carbon offset. But the way you're working is when you buy an Australian carbon credit unit, which is basically removing a tonne of carbon, you get 1,000 tokens minted. So roughly each one is worth 1 kilo of carbon. Just take us through this process and how it happens.
Sure. So to start with, what do you get when you get a BetaCarbon token is BetaCarbon will buy a tonne, and as you said, we will mint 1,000 kilograms off that tonne. So effectively, a BetaCarbon token is a participation on a notional basis, whereby you know that BetaCarbon will hold 1 tonne for every 1,000 tokens that are minted. Now, why is that important when we talk about taking a holiday and being offered an offset as an option as part of your flight? Look, I think there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's admirable that any consumer wants to do the right thing. I think if we look at how we activate this in a better way, the actual value proposition for a consumer who buys an offset at the checkout when they're buying a flight, they're actually buying that offset on behalf of Qantas. So they're giving Qantas or a Virgin or any of the offset programs out there, they are giving the money to that entity to go and buy a carbon credit. And then they take the credit for it in their accounts. Now, for me, it seems like a much better value proposition that you can actually go and buy that carbon credit or participation in that carbon market yourself through a BetaCarbon token, which will still leave the airline in a position where they also need to buy their own to offset the emissions of their core product. So what we've done with a BetaCarbon example there is we've created a situation where that the airline's bought one and you've bought one for yourself. So we've actually activated the asset class to a factor of 2.
Yeah, I think that way you're not actually giving the CEO of Qantas another bonus when you do it through BetaCarbon. Now, should we think about this more like water rights? Of course, water has become publicised in Australia over the last decade, and it has rising and falling values, mainly up, I have to say. But of course, that has become a secondary market as water is traded. So is carbon a little bit like that?
It is. What I would say about water rights is they're very geographical. They're literally to a river and a riverina or an area where they need that water for that agriculture, but you can trade them. They are rare, and so too are quality carbon credits. If we think about how rare a carbon credit is in relation to the rarity of water or the scarcity of water, is you can't really magic water up, and it's also very hard to magic up carbon credits in the Australian carbon market, because one of the most virtuous factors of our compliance market is to make a carbon credit, you actually have to do the work to sequester the carbon through the various projects that the Clean Energy Regulator will certify. So when we think about scarcity, to give you an idea, in Australia emits 400 million tonnes as a country, and the carbon credit market sequesters about 17.1 million as of the latest estimate from the Clean Energy Regulator for this year. So if we really wanted to be carbon neutral in this year, we'd have to create 25 times more carbon credits or pollute to a factor of about 95% less. And that's a pretty scary idea, that my son, who co-founded this company with me, needs to be 95% more efficient than I do to be carbon neutral. And that's where we really felt like the scarcity of this asset wasn't being activated because there was only 50 odd players who are active in the market.
Okay, so your son probably is someone who also has his eye on things like cryptos and NFTs and all of those other alternative asset classes. Should investors think about carbon credits a little bit like that? How do we sort of treat this? Is it like gold, or it's not quite like water rights, but where does it sit in terms of asset classes?
Look, as an asset class, it's compelling for me. It's because it's hard to access. Now, I wouldn't call it gold. Gold's a physical commodity. The ACCU is not a physical commodity, and crypto as well is also not a physical commodity. And I think the irony of putting these two things together, now we really consider ourselves a digital asset. Crypto is merely a rail for us to activate the asset class. And so when we think about this, when you have a ton of carbon and you know it's worth $55, because you could look up on a screen that it's worth $55, you automatically have some sort of bearing of what your cryptocurrency is worth. Much in the same way as the US dollar tether. Perhaps the most compelling thing about the BetaCarbon product is it's tethered on the downside, but actually the price could trade a lot higher. So if we create a demand vehicle which does instill a lot of community and people love purchasing it, they get given that as a reward product at the checkout, and we can really make it part of a ubiquitous consumer journey, the price could be trading above the carbon price to some significance. And we've seen that in ETF markets, in the carbon market in Europe. We've seen it in ETF markets in Bitcoin, which is the opposite when you've created a financial product from a cryptocurrency. So we've done the opposite again. We've taken a financial product and turned it into a cryptocurrency so that it can be distributed at the checkout and we can make it part of everyone's daily journey.
Okay, Guy, let's say I find the whole BetaCarbon proposition compelling. I want to get involved. Let's say I'm going to buy 100 of these, $5.5 grand's worth. What do I do? How do I do it?
Okay, so BetaCarbon's native exchange will go live in about 2 months' time. In the meantime, we are offering OTC trading. So if you're willing to buy more than $10,000 of it, we can facilitate that over the phone. It will be a decentralized journey until our native exchange is up and running. At that point, I probably worthwhile talking about that experience. It would be much the same as a CoinSpot journey. However, we've tried to make it far simpler. You can only use Aussie dollars to purchase your BetaCarbon, and you can sell it back for Aussie dollars when you're finished with it. If you wish to take it outside our environment to a different decentralized environment, such as Uniswap, you're welcome to do that. For us, what's the most important thing about our project is simply that for every token that you're holding, that's a permission to pollute that's taken out of the big polluters' hands.
Well, I think that's a good incentive enough, although I would just add the fascinating thing in the numbers here is that the ACCU, the carbon credit units, have risen 50% in 2021. The value is still half of the New Zealand equivalent and less than a third of the European one. So it sounds like there's a fair bit of upside there. Guy Dickinson, great to have you on the show today from BetaCarbon.
Thanks.
Really appreciate your time. and just taking us through it. I've kind of got my head around it now, which is great.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers.